The 1974 disappearance of 17-year-old Amy Billig. Was she kidnapped by a biker gang? In 1974, 17-year-old Amy Billig lived in the Coconut Grove neighborhood of Miami, Florida with her parents, Susan and Ned Billig, and her 16-year-old brother, Josh. The family had moved there from Oyster Bay, New York 6 years earlier, and Ned owned a local art gallery. At around noon on March 5, Amy returned home from school and phoned her father at his workplace to ask if she could borrow money since she was planning to meet some friends for lunch. Ned said Amy could meet him at the art gallery, located less than a mile away, to pick up the money. Amy was last seen by construction workers holding out her thumb to hitchhike near Main Highway, but she did not arrive at the art gallery or meet her friends for lunch and was subsequently reported missing. On March 18, a camera with Amy Billig's name on it was found next to the southbound lane of Florida's Turnpike approximately 250 miles north of Miami. It could not be conclusively determined if Amy had the camera with her at the time she disappeared, or if it might have been lost or stolen on a previous occasion. It contained a roll of film containing 4 undeveloped photographs, and while 3 of them were overexposed, the 4th photo featured a vine-covered wall with a white pickup truck parked in the background. The Billig family eventually received a phone call from a woman calling herself Susan Johnson. She claimed that Amy had been abducted by a motorcycle gang known as the Outlaws, and a friend of Johnson's had supposedly seen Amy with the bikers in Daytona Beach. It turned out the Outlaws had passed through Coconut Grove on the day Amy went missing. Months later, the Billigs received word that the Outlaws had been in Orlando and stayed in a clubhouse outside the nearby town of Kissimmee. Susan Billig traveled to the area and showed Amy's photograph to a number of people who remembered seeing her with the Outlaws. A convenience store manager recognized Amy as a young woman who often frequented the store with bikers. The manager said the woman always bought vegetable soup, and since Amy was a strict vegetarian, this convinced Susan it was her daughter. In November 1975, Susan was contacted by a man named Paul Branch, who belonged to a motorcycle gang called the Pagans. He recognized Amy's photo in a newspaper article and said he had bought her from a biker party in Orlando and owned her for a time. In July 1974, Branch left Amy with a friend of his before he wound up getting arrested. Branch spent some time in jail, but by the time he was released, Amy and his friend were gone. Branch also mentioned that she had a hidden 2-inch appendectomy scar on her lower body which matched a scar Amy had. Since Susan had never divulged this detail to either the police or the media, this convinced her that Branch was telling the truth. Branch offered to help Susan find Amy, but he ultimately led her on a wild goose chase, and after allegedly having his kneecaps broken by another biker gang, he broke off all contact with Susan. Shortly after Amy disappeared, the Billigs started receiving phone calls from a man calling himself Hal Johnson, who claimed that he had abducted Amy and was training her as a sex slave. These calls would continue for the next 20 years, as Johnson would repeatedly phone up the Billigs to describe the horrible things which were happening to Amy. Even after Ned passed away of cancer in 1993, Johnson continued to phone and harass Susan. For years, Johnson made his calls from various payphones, but he eventually started using a cell phone. In October 1995, police finally traced the calls to a 48-year-old U.S. Customs Department employee named Henry Johnson Blair. After he was arrested, Blair claimed that he suffered from alcoholism and depression and had an obsessive-compulsive disorder which prompted him to torment the Billigs for 20 years, but he also denied any involvement in Amy's disappearance. Blair was eventually convicted on 2 counts on misdemeanor stalking and received a 2-year prison sentence. It turned out that Amy's diary contained an entry written 6 weeks before she vanished which read, "Hank says as soon as I finish school, he wants me to go to South America with him. I told him he's crazy." None of Amy's family or friends recalled her knowing anyone named Hank, which was the name Blair happened to go by. Blair was living in Miami in 1974, and one of his duties with the Customs Department involved working as an undercover sky marshal, which required him to take trips to South America. During that time period, Blair also sometimes drove a white pickup truck, which had been featured in the undeveloped photograph from Amy's camera. Unfortunately, the photo was no longer available by this point, since it was destroyed when the police property room was cleaned out years earlier. It was unclear if Blair had an alibi on the day Amy went missing, as he had left with his wife on a honeymoon to San Francisco on February 22. The trip lasted between 10 to 13 days, but if he was gone the full 13 days, Blair would have been in California when Amy went missing on March 5. In the end, no evidence could be found to implicate Blair in Amy's disappearance. In October 1996, one of the detectives tracked down Paul Branch to a trailer in rural Virginia to re-interview him, and he would pass away of cancer on New Year's Eve. Months later, Susan was contacted by the producers of a British documentary about Amy's case, who informed her that Branch's girlfriend had heard a deathbed confession from him. They proceeded to film a meeting between Susan and the girlfriend, who told her that Branch said he witnessed Amy get killed at a biker party on the same day she disappeared. Amy apparently got so high on drugs that she mouthed off to one of the bikers, which led to her being gang raped by about 24 people. When Amy attempted to fight back, they injected her with more drugs, but she wound up overdosing, so they disposed of her body by tossing it into the Florida Everglades. However, once it came out that the girlfriend had been paid by the documentary crew to share her story, everyone became skeptical that this alleged confession ever took place. In 2005, after relentlessly pursuing her daughter for 3 decades, Susan Billig finally passed away of a heart attack at the age of 80. Investigators still lean towards the story about the confession being false, so it is still unclear what actually happened to Amy.